Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the special election results out of Texas from Tuesday night from the 34th Congressional District, as well as the primary results out of South Carolina, Nevada, North Dakota, and Maine. So we'll be taking a look at all of those races because they really exemplify trends we've been seeing throughout the primary cycle. And leading up to November, there's a lot of hints as to what we're expected to see in terms of Republican or Democratic control in either of the chambers. Again, if you look at the generic ballot, Democrats are down nationwide by about 3 points now, I believe. And in Texas in particular, you saw a flip happen. So now an open seat that was once held by a Democrat is now held by a Republican. So Mayra Flores, the winner of this election, will serve out the rest of the former congressman's term. So we'll take a look at all of those other races in just a second. But please, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing down below, hitting the like button. Really helps out the channel and it helps me make more videos like these. So anyway, let's just get straight into it. So Mayra Flores won the special election in the 34th Congressional District with 51% of the vote. This was a district that just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, went to the Democrats with 55.4% of the vote to 41.8% for the Republicans. So basically you go from a safe blue margin in 2020 to a likely margin for the Republicans in June of 2022. Now, there's a few caveats about this. Number one, this was a really low turnout election. You have just about under 29,000 people voting in this election, basically 200,000 or so in 2020. So you're seeing a huge drop off in turnout. I believe this election only had 14.5% of the turnout as the November 2021. So a huge drop off in turnout, but nonetheless, this is still a huge significant victory for the Republicans. This was a D+5 district. This was a district that Biden won by about 4 points. It now goes R plus 7.7. So that's a huge shift already off the bat. And it's in an area that has been shifting more and more Republican as time goes on. The Rio Grande Valley of Texas had a humongous shift to the right in 2020. This really kind of not offset, but helped to kind of stymie some Democratic gains in DFW, the Houston area, and of course Austin. So you had big shifts to the left there, but these shifts in the Rio Grande Valley were much larger. Now there's less people in the Rio Grande Valley, but long term, if Republicans can keep suburban margins where they are or improve slightly, and the Rio Grande Valley gets a lot redder, Texas will stay a red state for the foreseeable future. So it is pretty significant that that trend is continuing to play out. And we'll see how the Rio Grande Valley does end up voting in November with Greg Abbott and Beto on the ballot, as well as the down ballot House races. But Mayra Flores will go to Congress. She will be there until at least January of 2023. Whether she could win election in November is up in the air. Now, normally I wouldn't say that. If the district had stayed the same, it would kind of be a given that she would win re-election. But if we take a look at the district in November, it will be a D+17 district. It'll be a district that I think Biden won by about 12 or 13 points. The district before that was just D+5. Biden was up by 4. So the district goes heavily to the left. And this is one area where I think Republicans really kind of gave themselves a ceiling in the state of Texas. Given the kind of gerrymander they ended up drawing up, they left districts that were all relatively competitive in the Rio Grande, especially given what we saw in November 2020, and they made effectively 2 of them much harder to win. They made Cuellar's district D+7, and they made the 34th +17 for the Democrats. So really, they could have done a lot better in the Rio Grande Valley. If this district had stayed relatively the same, it wouldn't really even be a question as to whether Flores would win. She definitely would win this election again. One interesting takeaway, though, is given the low turnout, you see a county that's actually a red county, Kennedy County, going 50% for the Democrat, which is really interesting to see. It was a county that Trump got 65% of the vote in back in 2020. So something interesting you see with low turnout. Cameron County was the biggest county in this congressional district. Flores got 47.5, Donald Trump only getting 42.9 in 2020. So you're seeing improvements basically across the board, minus Kennedy County, which I think is just a weird outlier given the incredibly low turnout of this election. But nonetheless, a huge significant victory for Republicans. This district hadn't been in Republican hands, I believe, in well over a century. So it's a good sign for Republicans in the Valley. Now, moving on to the other states that we also had elections in. These were primaries, though, not general elections. So again, Democrats have lost another seat in the House of Representatives. Technically, it was an open seat, so this is going to be a Republican gain. So I think now Republicans are even closer to getting a majority. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's only about 5 seats that they really need to flip at this point. I could be wrong about that. I'm just doing that totally based on memory. But Republicans are much closer to a majority now. And if we take a look at South Carolina, we had some other interesting election results as well, particularly in the Republican primaries. First, we'll start off with the 7th Congressional District. Tom Rice, an impeachment Republican, was decimated in his primary. He only received 24.5% of the vote. His main challenger, Russell Fry, got 51.1% of the vote, so he avoided a runoff election with Tom Rice. And that's pretty impressive, given the fact that you had a number of Republicans gobbling up the anti-Tom Rice vote, essentially. And, if you added these all up together, Russell Fry would have won in a colossal landslide. But even so, for an incumbent, this was a pretty pathetic performance. This can all really be attributed to Tom Rice's impeachment vote. Before the 2020 election, Tom Rice was a fairly conservative Republican down the line, nothing too special, but had a pretty solid conservative voting record. Of course, after the election, after the subsequent January, a lot of things changed. Tom Rice kind of became more of a Kinzinger type of Republican, and the base rebuked him very heavily in this primary. So he lost by a landslide margin. Not really too surprising, though, but this is a bad omen for other Republicans in the impeachment camp, like Liz Cheney. I believe there's 2 in Washington state that are still running for re-election. They're probably likely to face a similar defeat. So all across the board, that's a main trend you're seeing this primary cycle. Republicans are cleaning house. They're getting rid of Republicans that were not on board with the Trump agenda, that voted to impeach Trump. They're even trying to get rid of Republicans that are on the more liberal end, the more quote-unquote rhino Republicans. And one of those was Nancy Mace, who survived her primary by about 8 points or so. She avoided a runoff. If she had gone below 50%, it would have had a runoff election in this district in a couple of weeks. She survived, but, for an incumbent Republican who flipped a district from blue to red, this is a pretty poor showing. And, this is a district that had gotten more conservative. If we take a look at South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, it went from in just an R plus 14, which is still a very Republican district, to R plus 17. The new district encompasses a wide array of more rural conservative territory, making the district redder, and also with new voters that are not as familiar with Nancy Mace, allowing Katie Arrington, the main challenger to Nancy Mace, who had the Trump endorsement, had a lot of the grassroots conservative movement behind her, to kind of gain fundraising and name recognition. And, even though she was out fundraised, I believe like 10-1 or something like that, Nancy Mace still ended up prevailing, but it was a pretty close race. Nevada was also a big state in terms of primaries. Adam Laxalt, the former Republican Attorney General, won by a landslide in his primary against Sam Brown. This really wasn't so much of an ideological battle this primary. Both candidates essentially agreed on everything, but the Laxalt family name carries a lot of weight in Nevada Republican politics, and that's really the main reason why Laxalt, we just got some results now, why Laxalt won this primary by such a large amount. Sam Brown, who is a Purple Heart veteran who was wounded in combat, he came in second with 34.4% of the vote. Again, pretty impressive considering he's going up against Adam Laxalt, who was a Attorney General and just a big name in Nevada politics. In terms of the governor's primary, another huge rebuke of the so-called, rhino wing of the Republican Party, or just the wing of the party that really isn't on board fully with the Trump agenda. Dean Heller, the former Republican senator out of Nevada, lost by about 5 points in 2018 during his re-election, came in a distant third at just 13.4% of the vote. A very poor showing for an incumbent, to say the least. Just 13.4% of the vote as a former Republican senator out of the state. And I believe Trump endorsed Joe Lombardo, if I'm not mistaken, or he might have stayed out of this primary, I'm not sure. But Joey Gilbert, who was the most conservative of the candidates, came in second with 27.2% of the vote. Most of his vote share came out of northern Nevada, although Joe Lombardo won his largest share of the vote in Clark County. That's the county he's sheriff in. That's really what carried him over the top. No real surprise there. Clark County is the most populous county in Nevada by far. Even though it's more of a Democratic county, the vast majority of Republican votes in the state also come out of Clark County. So again, Joe Lombardo got 69,000 votes out of Nevada. 49,000 of those votes were out of Clark County. So all around, not a surprising result. Joe Lombardo led the primary field pretty consistently. What I think is surprising is how poor Dean Heller did in this primary. Really, again, just a terrible showing for an incumbent Republican senator and a rebuke of sort of the old way of doing things, the old guard of the Republican Party. Dean Heller was elected back in 2012, was very wishy-washy on President Trump, tried to run with Trump in 2018 on that record, but ultimately voters really didn't buy it. Again, Adam Laxalt actually outran Dean Heller. Adam Laxalt wasn't even in office, so it just goes to show you that Nevada Republicans really sent a strong statement to Dean Heller that they don't really want him representing the state's party any longer. So that was a big result out of the governor's race. Secretary of State was an open race. Jim Marchant, who I think was the Trump-endorsed candidate, won pretty resoundingly in the Secretary of State election. There were a number of election integrity issues kind of brought up in this campaign, and ultimately that put him over the top in the state of Nevada. So North Dakota, really not a whole lot to talk about. Also, like, none of the vote in, but, it's North Dakota. None of these races were really that competitive. But there's actually a number of state house races where you saw a number of primary challengers against incumbents. Moving on to the state of Maine, Bruce Poliquin in the 2nd District, who will face Jared Golden in November, won his primary handedly. He is another candidate similar to Nancy Mace that is more of a social liberal, very fiscally conservative though, very business-minded. He did extremely well, really broadly all across. It doesn't matter whether the municipalities are more populated or not. Bruce Poliquin really did extremely well, and he was the nominee back in 2018. He was a former congressman, so he had wide name recognition. But Elizabeth Caruso, who was more of the America First candidate, was able to build up a lot of support around the district, despite also being out fundraised by a large amount. And I don't think Trump made an endorsement in this race. Had Trump endorsed Caruso, perhaps things would have gone differently. But Bruce Poliquin prevailing in Maine's 2nd Congressional District. And that's really the summary of the results out of Tuesday night. I think we're having Virginia on Tuesday, next Tuesday rather. So stay tuned for those. We'll be live streaming those results. A couple of interesting primaries there to follow. So we'll see. We might do a live stream next Tuesday. So stay tuned for that. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.